form a more perfect union. We wrote a constitution and a bill of rights for life and liberty. In democracy, we carry responsibilities. In democracy, we need everyone to see that our democracy is counting on you and me.
Welcome, everybody. Here to talk with you today. My name's Kevin Ritter. I am a Washington County Commissioner, but more importantly than that, for many, many years, over 2 decades, I've been a college professor and have taught classes in American history and American government. What I'm going to be talking with you about today are the 4 great founding documents. The first of those that we'll cover will be the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. We'll take a short break, and then I'll talk about the U.S. Constitution and the Northwest Ordinance. So let's jump right into it. When we talk about the Declaration of Independence, what I'd like to start with is the world into which that document was born. We'll talk a little bit about the Declaration itself, how it was written, by whom it was written, the 5-man writing committee that created that famous work. And then I want to finish with the fates of some of the individual signers of the Declaration, what they put on the line so that we can live in a republic today. Now, the story of the Declaration begins in the year 1760. 1760 is important because that's the year that George III comes to the throne of England. Just 22 years old, he was third in a line of kings known as the Hanoverian dynasty. The Hanoverians are a bit of an odd case in British history. In fact, they're not British at all, they're German. George III's great-grandfather, George I, was invited by Parliament to sit on the British throne after the childless Queen Anne died in 1708. Neither George I nor George II spoke English, and both took a very hands-off approach to running the British Empire. As a result, during their reign, the power of the monarchy diminished while the power of Parliament grew. Even though he was a Hanoverian, George III was very different from his grandfather and great-grandfather before him. He was British in his thinking, British in his upbringing, British in his schooling, and he spoke English as his first language. Most importantly, he was determined to reverse the relationship between king and Parliament. This mindset of George III led almost immediately to tension between the Crown and the American colonies. A second issue, also contributing to the tension between England and the colonies, was the King's insistence that the colonies pay their fair share of the 7 Years' War. In fact, he wanted them to pay the bulk of those costs. The 7 Years' War, of course, was fought between 1756 and 1763. Since this war was largely fought in North America, the king insisted the colonists pay for it. To this end, he sought to tax them directly, an unprecedented move. Colonists had paid taxes, so the issue is not paying taxes, but rather where they're paying them. For 150 years, colonists had paid taxes to their colonial capital. So if you lived in Massachusetts, your taxes went to Boston. If you lived in New Jersey, your taxes went to Trenton. What the king is suggesting is those taxes, rather than going to the colonial capitals, would go to London, and they may or may not come back to the colonies. This is when we first begin to hear cries of taxation without representation. There's an important distinction to be made here, and I think George III has been given a bit of a bad rap by historians. The colonists who were complaining about lack of representation were saying that there is no individual member who sits in Parliament on behalf of Massachusetts or Connecticut or New Jersey or Virginia. In that, they were right. That's called direct representation. But what King George III argued was that every colony was represented virtually, virtual representation. He said, by virtue of the fact that you're part of the British Empire, every member of Parliament sits on your behalf and is concerned with your welfare. So I think King George III was trying to honestly answer the question of representation. The years from 1760 through 1775 were a struggle between the colonists who were determined to assert their rights as British citizens and their king, who saw them with a second-class status. Finally, in the summer of 1776, the American colonies declared their independence. In July of 1776, 56 representatives gathered at Independence Hall. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. There they debated and eventually signed the Declaration, thereby officially separating the American colonies from their mother country. This famous document was written in the form of a letter of grievance to George III of England. The purpose of the document was to show that George III had become a tyrant or a despot, and that as a result he no longer merited the loyalty of his American subjects. As a result, the largest part of this document is a list of 28 separate crimes alleged by the colonists against George III and Parliament. Now let me give you an example of what the colonists considered crimes at this time. The first example is what they call the keeping of standing armies. In order to understand that, you have to understand the nature of 18th century warfare. In the 18th century, if there was a conflict, the king would raise an army, he would outfit that army, he would train that army, feed that army, send them off to battle, and when battle was over, they'd come home, take off their uniforms, and they'd go back to their daily lives. There weren't standing armies in the 18th century the way that there are today. At the end of the 7 Years' War, King George III elected to keep a standing army in North America. The colonists thought it was to intimidate or bully them. King George III said it was for their own safety. The French were a threat. The Native Americans were a threat. So he said he was keeping his troops there to protect them. A second crime alleged by the colonists against the king was what was known as the quartering of troops. Technically, this was legal. Parliament had passed what was known as the Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act said that by order of the king, the colonists were required to pay for both housing and food for any of those British soldiers in North America. So imagine a situation where you go home this evening and there's a knock at your door, and standing on your porch are 3 or 4 in their bright red lobsterback uniforms, uniformed British soldiers. And they say, by order of the king, feed us and house us. Perfectly legal, but obviously offensive to the American colonists. They didn't like having to take that on. The other thing about the Quartering Act that the colonists found especially offensive was it allowed the British to take over any building that they deemed necessary to their effort here in North America. So Farmer Jones, Farmer Smith builds a new barn, and the British deem it necessary for their effort, they can legally take that building over. A third example of a crime alleged against the king was his refusal to answer what were called petitions. Now, any British subject had the ability to petition his king. That was his right as an Englishman. So people like Benjamin Franklin and others wrote letters to the king saying, our rights as Englishmen are being abridged. Your duty as our sovereign is to ensure justice. Many of those letters simply went unanswered, and as a result, the colonists see that as a crime. Finally, fourthly, the next example I'd give you of a crime alleged by the colonists we've already talked about, and that's the changing nature of tax collection. Colonists were used to paying taxes to their colonial capitals. George III was suggesting they change that arrangement and pay those directly to London. Now, while there was a 5-man writing committee chosen by the members of the Second Continental Congress, the document they produced was written largely by a Virginian, written by Thomas Jefferson. Very briefly, let me go through that 5-man writing committee. I think it'd be of interest to the crowd who those folks were. 3 of those names you're likely going to know. Those were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. There are 2 lesser-known members. One of those was Robert Livingston, who would later go on to represent the United States at the court of Napoleon. He would make the Louisiana Purchase without the authority of the White House or of Thomas Jefferson at that time, and he'd spend his Atlantic trip coming back to try to figure out how to explain to Thomas Jefferson what he'd done. The 5th member of that writing committee is a guy by the name of Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman is from Connecticut. He's a very devout Christian man. He had 14 children. It was his practice to read through the Bible every year from cover to cover. He'd take copious notes and mark things in the margins. And at the end of the year, Roger Sherman would give that Bible to one of his 14 children. So those are the 5 individuals that make up the so-called writing committee. The way the document was created was there was debate during the day. This is called the Committee of the Whole, all 56 members sitting. They would debate what should go into the document. People like Thomas Jefferson would take notes. At the end of the day, those notes would be marshaled together to give into the 5-man writing committee. They would retire to a local tavern and they would create the document. What was especially annoying to Thomas Jefferson was he didn't like being corrected. When he would come back the following day, they would take what they created the night before and present it to the Committee of the Whole. And those members, just like school teachers, would go through and cross things out and suggest better wording. Thomas Jefferson, the beneficiary of a classical education, thought that was beneath him to be corrected in that way. So there was some tension over that. Jefferson, we know, was one of the quieter members of the Continental Congress. In fact, he spoke nary a word the entire time that summer. He was chosen as the primary writer of the Declaration, again, because of his classical education. The other members of that body believed that Jefferson was best equipped to write a document that would be accessible to the world. They weren't writing this document simply for the eyes of the king or simply for the eyes of the aristocracy, the well-born. They wanted this to be accessible to the common man and woman. They chose Jefferson because of his ability to write. Now, this is something that separates the American founding from that of any other nation. Our founders saw their cause as universal. The rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness were not just American rights in their eyes, but rather universal rights endowed to every man and woman by their Creator. This is truly revolutionary. Because the founders viewed their cause as universal, and because they knew they would need assistance in fighting the mightiest army in the world, they sent copies of the Declaration to all corners of the earth. They had this document translated into different languages and literally sent out all over the world. Now, one of the things that strikes me most deeply about the writing of the Declaration is the courage that it took the 56 men who finally affixed their names to the document. At the time the Declaration was signed, independence was anything but a foregone conclusion. In fact, to that point, about 9 months into the war with Great Britain, the Continental Army had fared very poorly. George Washington had been a miracle worker just in keeping that army together. Jefferson and the signers knew that when they signed this document, they would be considered traitors to the king and that they would be targeted by the British Army. There are many anecdotes about the courage of the signers, but one of my favorites involves a funny story about a pair of best friends, Benjamin Harrison of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. These two are kind of a Mutt and Jeff pair. They're funny to look at. Benjamin Harrison was well over 6 feet tall, over 300 pounds. He had a big booming voice. His best friend, Elbridge Gerry, was barely 5 feet tall and just about 120 pounds. So they were funny just in their appearance. They were standing the day that most of the signers affixed their names to this document, and Harrison and Gerry were standing and talking about their likely fate, what it was going to be like to be hung. And Benjamin Harrison said loud enough for everybody in the room to hear, "With me, it'll be over just like that. With my size and my girth, when they drop me, it won't be painful." And then he paused and looked at the much smaller Gerry, and he said, "With you, my little friend, you'll be dancing on air an hour after I'm gone." So even at this moment that these guys are declaring themselves traitors according to British law, even at this moment when they're putting themselves on a list to be hunted down, they have courage and they understand what they're doing. These men knew exactly what their fate would be once they put their name on the Declaration. They realized the gravity of their actions. They knew that they would be hunted men and that they would likely die at the hands of the British. Still, in the closing line of the Declaration, these 56 men, our founders, pledged not only to each other, but to all of posterity, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Even before the list was published, the British marked down every member of Congress suspected of having put his name to treason. All of them became objects of vicious manhunts. Some of them were taken. Some of them, like Jefferson, had very narrow escapes. Thomas Jefferson escaped out the back door of his home about the same time the British were entering the front door, and he escaped into the woods. All who had property or families near British strongholds suffered. Now, let me say just a couple words about the fate of four of our founders, four of the gentlemen that did put their names on this document. All of the signers suffered in some way, but I want to highlight the story, as I said, of just four that I think well represents these brave men and what they gave up to found our country. The first of those is a delegate by the name of Francis Lewis. Lewis was a delegate of New York. After he put his name on the Declaration, he saw his home plundered and his estates in what is now Harlem completely destroyed by British soldiers. Mrs. Lewis was captured and treated with great brutality by those same British soldiers. And though she was later exchanged for 2 British prisoners through the efforts of Congress, she died from the effects of her abuse. So Mr. Lewis gave his wife. John Hart, delegate of New Jersey, risked his life to return home to see his dying wife. John Hart got word just a couple days before the Second Continental Congress concluded that his wife was seriously ill. When he had nearly arrived home, he was met by Hessian soldiers. Hessian soldiers are those mercenaries, German mercenaries, fighting alongside the British. Those Hessian soldiers rode after him and he escaped into the woods. While his wife lay on her deathbed, the Hessians ruined his farm and wrecked his homestead. For the next several months, the 68-year-old Hart slept in caves and in the woods as he was hunted across the countryside. When at long last, emaciated by his hardship, he was able to return home, he found that his wife had already been buried and his 13 children scattered. Those under 18 were sent to England to be adopted by other families, and Hart never saw any of his children again. He died a broken man in 1779 without ever reuniting with his family. Thomas Nelson, delegate of Virginia, had been the governor of Virginia, was at the front in command of Virginia military forces at the Battle of Yorktown. Thomas Nelson, during his time as the Virginia governor, had built the beautiful governor's mansion, or palace, as they called it. During the Battle of Yorktown, the British general Cornwallis and his staff had captured that home, captured the governor's mansion, and Cornwallis had moved his headquarters into Nelson's former home. Nelson is standing on a ridge next to a line of American gunners looking down on that home, and while the American cannonballs were making a shambles of the town around this house, Governor Nelson's home remained untouched. As the day wore on, Nelson finally turned in rage to the American gunners and asked, "Why do you spare my home?" And they said, "Sir, out of respect for you." Nelson said, "Give me the cannon." And he fired on a magnificent home himself and destroyed it, smashing it to bits. Nelson's sacrifice wasn't quite yet over. During the course of the war, he had raised over $2 million for the revolutionary cause by pledging his own estates. When those loans came due, a newer peacetime Congress refused to honor them, and Nelson's property was forfeit. He was never reimbursed, and he died impoverished just a few years later at the age of 50. Finally, Abraham Clark, also from New Jersey. During the war, Clark gave 2 sons to the officer corps of the Revolutionary Army. They were both captured and sent to the infamous British prison hulk, the Jersey. You see, during the war, the British didn't build prisons for those that they captured. Rather, they sent them to prison ships off the East Coast. The Jersey was the worst of these ships. It was known as the Hell Ship because of the conditions experienced by the men who were imprisoned there. There were poor rations and unclean water. There were poor medical care, and filthy conditions. As a result, there was rampant disease. Because their father had signed the Declaration, the younger Clarks were treated with a special brutality. Just 2 weeks before the end of the war, the British got a message to Abraham Clark and told him that if he would come out against the war, if he would come out against General Washington, if he would come out against the revolution and in favor of king and of country, they would release his sons. Abraham Clark's answer was no, and his sons died as a result of their treatment on the Jersey. These are just 4 of 56 stories that I assure you are very, very similar. What I want to leave you with before we shift our focus to the document itself is that idea that those 56 signers gave significantly so that we can live in the republic that we enjoy today. What I want to shift our focus to now is an actual look at the document, the Declaration of Independence. We understand the Declaration as something like an act of incorporation used in founding a business in the same way that we might view the Constitution as the bylaws for our country. Rarely do we think of the Declaration as a literary document, but many historians agree it's one of the greatest literary creations in the Western tradition. It's an almost perfect synthesis of style and of form and of content. That's how I want to approach the Declaration for our remaining time, as a literary document. In doing so, I would tell you that the Declaration is basically divided into 5 parts. Those parts are the introduction, the preamble, the indictment of George III, the denunciation of the British people, and of course, the conclusion. Let's take each of those one by one, very briefly. The introduction is interesting in that it immediately dignifies the revolution as a contest of principle. It implies that the American cause has a special claim to moral legitimacy. This claim is based upon the author's appeal, Jefferson's appeal, to natural law. The author is outlining a principle already accepted in British law at the time. The idea that any law that is not in accordance with natural law, or Jefferson would have said with God's law, is in fact no law at all. And it's the duty of the people to resist such a law. He would have called it despotism. The most important word in the introduction is the word necessary, because it establishes the tone for the rest of the document. In 18th century parlance, the word necessary has even more strongly deterministic overtones than it does today. To the American colonists, necessary meant inescapable, inevitable, unavoidable, cannot be otherwise. Recourse to war, the war again had already begun, but recourse to war was lawful when it became necessary, argued Jefferson. One other thing that I think we have to point out about the introduction is that it describes the American colonists as one people and the British as another. The implication of this description is that 2 alien peoples cannot be made one. Jefferson is making clear from the beginning of the document that a split has already occurred. The Declaration is merely a formal recognition of that fact. In other words, this is not a civil war. It's a war between 2 separate peoples. This is important because it opens up the possibility of assistance from other European powers, something the colonists thought essential to their survival. The next section of the Declaration is called the preamble. This we remember most of us from school. The purpose of the preamble is to outline a general philosophy of government. The preamble includes the foundational ideas of the future American government. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The question at this point would be, who grants rights? Jefferson would answer, God grants rights. This is not, Jefferson makes clear, a social compact between men, like that which would be created a decade later in France. Jefferson would say it's an effort to bring temporal law in line with natural law. The preamble mentioned 3 basic inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then the preamble explains how these rights are to be protected. Jefferson says to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This answers the question, what is the purpose of government? Lastly, the preamble explains the remedy to be imposed by the people should government lose sight of its purpose or become despotic. And this section makes a lot of folks nervous today. On both sides of the political aisle, there's significant dissatisfaction with government today. Jefferson says whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Later, Jefferson states it's not only the right, but the duty of the people to act against despotic government. As to the style of the preamble, there's a logical progression of thought in which each proposition builds on the one before it. In other words, there's a structural unity. This style was very popular in the 18th century. It's called the style periodique. With this style, the reader is drawn to believe that the final proposition, in this case the right to revolution, is proven by the preceding propositions. It's almost the way an attorney would argue in court. If A is true and B is true and C is true, then D must be true. The third section of the Declaration is known as the Indictment of George III. This is the portion of the Declaration that takes up nearly 2/3 of the document. And we said earlier that this includes 28 separate charges made by the Second Continental Congress against their king. To prove the king's tyranny, the writers suggest that, quote, facts be submitted to a candid world. Candid means, of course, free from bias or malice. It means fair, impartial, just. The implication is that any impartial reader will see the case plainly. Use of the word facts has added meaning in the 18th century as well. At the time this document was written, facts were something that were used exclusively in legal indictments, not position papers. So this language carries a special weight. The use of the word facts also harkens back to the 16th and 17th century meaning, which denotes an evil deed or a crime. By listing the king's crimes, the author creates the impression of a piling up of facts against a guilty party. The technique also provides a rhythmic cadence, signaling blow after blow being suffered by the colonists. Notice the use of value-laden verbs near the end of the list. Words like plundered, ravaged, burnt, destroyed. This is meant to evoke strong emotions in the reader. Lastly, the ambiguity of these charges makes them hard to refute. Jefferson did this intentionally. Imagine if Jefferson had said, the king on Tuesday the 13th of October did the following. Well, that's easy for an attorney to go into a court of law and argue against that sort of specific charge. Again, Jefferson makes ambiguous charges. He's plundered, ravaged, burnt, and destroyed. That's much harder to argue against. The fourth section of the Declaration of Independence is one of particular contention amongst the five-man writing committee. This is known as the denunciation of the British people. This portion of the Declaration was a big area of contention, especially between Jefferson and John Adams. Jefferson really wanted to condemn his British brethren. Those like John Adams recognized that it wasn't politically expedient to alienate those who might still be won for the cause. Here I would use the example of a member of Parliament, Irish member of Parliament, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, even though he's a member of the British Parliament, spoke on behalf of the American colonies in Parliament. It took great courage to do that. That's who John Adams has in mind when he cautions Jefferson about denouncing the British people too harshly. Jefferson's original denunciation was far more strongly worded than what we see in the finished document. This section finishes the case for independence by restating that the Americans and the British are two distinct peoples. Finally, the conclusion, unlike the rest of the document, this section is very formulaic, very, very similar to what you'd find in other 18th century documents. But for the final sentence, there is a sense of building drama throughout the entire Declaration, which comes to a head in the particularly solemn vow about lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. This final pledge is meant to appeal to the cult of honor that existed amongst educated persons in the 18th century. The Declaration, in Jefferson's words, begins in an impersonal, even philosophical voice. It ends in very personal terms. The persistent use of personal pronouns in the concluding paragraphs brings the action to a very personal level. I think all of us understand the effect of that declaration. It officially separates the American colonies from mother country. The war would still have to be fought of course. It would take another 6.5, 7 years before that issue was decided on the battlefield. The Americans, existing now in what they would have called a state of nature, had to think about what comes next. What do they set up? What sort of government do they establish to rule even during the course of the war? That leads us, and we'll spend far less time on this, that leads us to our second founding document, that being the Articles of Confederation. So let me spend just a couple minutes describing the Articles. From 1776 through 1787, our new nation operated under a government laid out in what was called the Articles of Confederation. Supporters of this short-lived experiment pointed to three distinct accomplishments of the Confederation. Sometimes in history we like to go back, and many folks don't even realize that we had a form of government prior to the U.S. Constitution. Those who do like to be very critical of the Confederation government. But I do want to point out their three accomplishments because they're significant. The first thing the Confederation government did was it won the war with Great Britain. No small task. Secondly, the Confederation government won the peace. It's this government that signs the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And finally, it's this Confederation government that creates the Northwest Territory. Very important to those of us, obviously, here in the state of Ohio. Unfortunately, despite these three major accomplishments, this is a form of government with many weaknesses, and I'd like to focus on some of those. The most distinctive feature of the Confederation government was its weak executive, and that's actually by design. This branch of government was made intentionally weak because of the founders' experience with George III. Remember, he was someone they called a tyrant and a despot. They didn't want to separate from England simply to create a new tyrant or despot. So the president had very, very few powers. There's some debate over how many presidents we had under the Articles of Confederation. Most historians would agree that there were 14. That makes George Washington our 15th president when he takes office in 1788. A second weakness that the Confederation government has is it has very little power to tax. Really, the only revenues in the coffers of this government are raised by tariffs on goods leaving and coming into the country. They had the power, this government did, to ask nicely from the states to so-called requisition money. They could write a letter to Connecticut and say, the Treasury's getting low, would you please send something? And as you can imagine, states sometimes did and sometimes did not. So this is a government that is almost always out of money. The third weakness was this government had very little power to conduct diplomacy on behalf of the states. This became very frustrating for individual states, so individual states began to negotiate their own deals. So you'd have Massachusetts signing a treaty with France, and Virginia signing a treaty with England, and New Jersey signing a treaty with a third European nation. It was very, very confusing, very, very difficult to have any sort of united foreign policy. Lastly, and I think this is the largest weakness, Each of the 13 states had veto power over legislation. So you can imagine a scenario where 12 of the states are agreed on a piece of legislation, and little Rhode Island comes along and vetoes it. It was almost impossible to pass legislation under the Confederation agreement. As a result, because of these weaknesses, by the mid-1780s, the country was in serious crisis. In an effort to address this crisis and revise the Articles, representatives from several states met in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786. They came with a very limited goal. Their goal was to establish a national plan on regulating trade. Even with this limited goal, they were unable to come to an agreement. At the close of the convention, the delegates discussed the possibility of calling a constitutional convention the following year to revise the Articles. Alexander Hamilton is literally grabbing at the coats of members as they're trying to leave, and he's begging them to please come back again the following summer to Philadelphia. Congress did just that, asking each state to send representatives to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Still, there was little expectation that the Philadelphia Convention would fare any better than the Annapolis Convention. That changed when the need for a convention was given greater urgency by the outbreak of rebellion in western Massachusetts. This happens in the fall and winter of 1786 and 87. Looking for tax relief, monetary reform, and military back pay owed by the state government, a number of citizens in western Massachusetts rebelled under the leadership of a man by the name of Daniel Shays. The Shays Rebellion was eventually put down by the Massachusetts militia, not by the national government. The national government is not strong enough at this point to put down a couple hundred farmers in rebellion in western Massachusetts. The Massachusetts militia had to come in and put down that rebellion. This is exactly what folks said was the problem with the Articles. The national government, the national army has to be strengthened if this union is going to survive. Without the Shays Rebellion as a proximate cause of real anxiety around the country, the Constitutional Convention that we'll talk about in our next video would almost surely not have happened in the summer of 1787. Thank you. When the Constitutional Convention convened in 1787, the original states, with the exception of Rhode Island, collectively appointed 70 individuals to meet in Philadelphia. A number of those who were selected did not accept or could not attend. It's important at this point, I think, right at the outset, to explain that even our founders at this point in 1787 had become divided into two large groups that held differing opinions on the need for a new constitution. Historian Larry Schweikert calls these two groups the two streams of liberty. Let me very quickly go through these two groups and what they stand for. The first is the Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalist leaders like Sam Adams and Patrick Henry were sympathetic to what they called the spirit of 76. They felt that the Articles of Confederation laid out a good system. They liked that it protected the sovereignty of the states against centralized power. Their greatest fear, you see, was the consolidation of power in that centralized authority. They were very suspicious of the motives of those who had called for a constitutional convention. On the other side of the aisle were the Nationalists or the Federalists, leaders like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison. They believed that the national government had to be strengthened, or it would most assuredly continue to flounder. They pointed to the Confederation's inability to supply the Continental Army during the war. These leaders, Madison especially, believed that more power had to be ceded by the states to the central government in order for the nation to reach its full potential. They looked to broaden the power of the federal government to tax and regulate commerce. They saw what they believed to be the huge economic potential of the country. In the end, very few leaders of the anti-federalist persuasion chose to attend the Philadelphia Convention. Sam Adams and Patrick Henry didn't even go. Patrick Henry was asked by a member of the media why he chose not to attend. He said, "Because I smell a rat." In choosing not to attend, the Anti-Federalists largely ceded the convention to the Federalist point of view. Now, of those who did choose to attend, they ranged in age from Jonathan Dayton, who was only 26, to Benjamin Franklin, who was 81. Benjamin Franklin had been the oldest member of the Second Continental Congress when they drafted the Declaration of Independence. He was 70 years of age at the time. 11 years later, he's still the oldest member of this body at 81. Franklin suffered from kidney stones and gallstones, gout, and a number of other maladies. And because the streets were paved with cobblestones, it was very, very difficult for Benjamin Franklin to get to Independence Hall every day for discussion. As a result, they worked out a system where 4 of the prisoners would be taken from the local jail. They would put Benjamin Franklin in a sedan chair and hoist that chair onto their shoulders, and they would literally carry him through the streets. After the first couple days, adoring crowds began to show up, and Benjamin Franklin saw this as an opportunity to wave to those crowds and greet supporters. The average age of those who gathered that summer in Philadelphia was just 42, so it was a relatively young group. Of the 55 delegates who did attend, and when I say 55, there were typically no more than 38 or 39 in attendance on any given day, but there were 55 separate individuals who participated at one time or another. Of those 55, 39 of them had legislative experience. They had served in their colonial legislatures, or they had served in the Confederation legislature, so they had legislative experience. 8 of the 55 had worked in state constitutional conventions, so they had already done what this group was proposing to do, write a new constitution. That experience would be very helpful. 7 of these 55 members had executive experience. They had been governors of their states. 1/3 of this group had military experience. They had served in the Continental Army fighting the British. Nearly all of those in attendance were what Thomas Jefferson would have called natural aristocrats. This is a group that takes their political superiority for granted. They saw it as the inevitable consequence of their social and economic position. Today we would call them community leaders. While some of this group were still wealthy, many had lost a great deal during the war and the ensuing bad economy. Some even had to borrow money to attend the convention. That's one big difference between the group that meets in 1776, when delegates came with their carriages and in some cases their slaves, and they rented the most beautiful homes in Philadelphia for that summer. In 1787, it's a very different sort of economic group. Many of the members chose to rent quarters together, so they bunked up with a roommate. The last thing I would say about this group of 55 individuals is there's a very important minority that is going to have to be satisfied if this document is going to have any respectability amongst the public. And that is the small group of 12 that either own slaves or manage slave-owned operations. If all 12 of those individuals refuse to sign on to the document, that document is going to be seen as illegitimate. So they're going to have to try to figure out, the founders are going to have to try to figure out how to walk that very narrow line. The group that gathered in June was composed, as I said, of 55 men. They met in the same room in Independence Hall where 11 years earlier the Second Continental Congress had authorized and signed the Declaration of Independence. The delegates at this convention had one advantage over those that had met 11 years previously. That was that independence from Great Britain was already a fact. They didn't have to explain why the break was necessary. As a result, they could focus on the task at hand. But the question was, what was that task? Were they in Philadelphia simply to fine-tune the existing government? Or were they there to create something entirely new? If so, this went way beyond the charge that most had been given by the people of their states when they were chosen. The issue of whether they were there to tinker with the Articles or begin anew was decided shortly after the convention commenced. They decided to create something new. I used a phrase in our first video, the state of nature. This is the same state that the nation finds it in when they take the vote to get rid of the existing government, the existing Articles of Confederation. Once this monumental decision was made to get rid of the Articles, the question is, where do we go from here? Into this void, or into this vacuum, steps the man who would later be known as the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Madison had arrived in Philadelphia 10 days before any of the other delegates because he imagined that this eventuality might take place. He arrived early and found in his quarters books that had been sent by his best friend, Thomas Jefferson, who was our minister to France. And these books were on the history of republics. So the Swiss Republic, the Greek republics, the Roman Republic. Madison had written to Jefferson about the upcoming convention and said, I suspect we may form a new type of government. I want you to send me reading materials. Jefferson had collected these materials in several different languages, sent them to Philadelphia, and they were waiting for James Madison. For those 10 days, Madison spent 16 to 18 hours a day, much of it by candlelight in the evenings, reading this history. And he was creating what were known as the Virginia Resolves, a plan of government. So when that moment happens, when the vote is taken to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, Madison is ready. And he says, gentlemen, here is a path forward. Here's a map for our discussions. As the delegates set their course, they realized that there was one general issue and two specific issues that they were going to have to deal with. The general issue was, of course, how strong to make this new federal government. Many of the delegates, the Federalists especially, remember they outnumber the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists believed that a strong national government was essential to bring together 13 disparate states. However, their recent experience with despotism told them that a strongly centralized government could also be the ruin of a new republic. The specific issues this group would have to consider were representation and slavery. And I want to take each of those in turn. So let's start with the representation question. The disagreement on representation came between the large and the small states. Large and growing states like Virginia wanted increased power in a new national government. Small states feared that they may have little power if something new were done. Debate centered on two plans for representation. I will tell you there was a third plan that was offered. It had very little support, but because of the person that offered it, I will mention it here in a moment, but I want to focus on the two serious plans. The first plan that was offered is what's known as the Virginia Plan. This was written by James Madison, but he chose not to present it. One of the things I admire about James Madison was his humility. Madison understood that because he had been a sickly child and spoke barely above a whisper, because he was just over 5 feet tall, just over 100 pounds, not terribly good looking, he didn't make a very imposing or impressive visual presentation. Even though he wrote the plan, he chose the 34-year-old dark and swarthy, those were words used to describe him at the time, Edmund Randolph, governor of Virginia. Edmund Randolph stood and explained the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan Randolph suggested that representation should be based upon population. Now this makes perfect sense from the Virginians' perspective. If you added the population of the other 12 states together, Virginia still had more people. So if representation would be based upon population, this would be a government run by the Virginians. At the moment Edmund Randolph suggested that representation should be based upon population, the representatives from the small states leapt to their feet and began to pillar him with terms like tyrant and despot. They said, "You're no better than George III." George Washington, the president of the convention, had to gavel things to a close, and for 3 days he let the group cool off before they came back and heard about a second plan. When they came back, the second plan was offered by William Patterson of New Jersey. This is known as the New Jersey or the Small State Plan. Patterson said very simply that representation had been equal under the Articles of Confederation. It should be equal under this new government. No state should have any more of a vote or a sway than any other state. Of course, we're at an impasse. The large states line up behind the Virginia plan, the small states line up behind the New Jersey plan. And then Alexander Hamilton gets to his feet. Alexander Hamilton would offer a third plan, known simply as the Hamilton Plan. And in this impasse, Hamilton said, gentlemen, we don't have to choose either the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan. In fact, we have a plan, a perfect plan for government. It is the British plan. Well, you can imagine the catcalls that went on, the guffaws and the shouting, and again, George Washington at that moment gavelled things to silence before Hamilton stood on his feet for over 3 hours and explained his plan. Hamilton suggested several things that I think are of interest. He was concerned primarily about the stability of government. So one of the things that Hamilton suggested was, he said, I think that our representatives should serve for life. Not a 2-year term or a 4-year term or a 6-year term. They should serve for life because that would add stability. He also suggested that the executive should serve for life. They hadn't yet chosen the term president for the executive. They're still calling him the executive. That executive should serve for life. Well, again, folks jump to their feet and they say, you're trying to create a king. Alexander Hamilton would say, no, this is not going to be passed hereditarily from one person down to a son or a daughter. I'm not suggesting monarchy, but I think the executive should rule for life. Finally, and I think this is probably the most overbearing of the things that Hamilton suggested, he said under my plan the federal government would have the right to override any state or local law. In other words, all laws would be made from the federal level. Hamilton again saw this as essential. There had to be power in the federal government. Well, when Alexander Hamilton finally sat down, there was no second to his plan. There was no support for his plan. I mention it again simply because of Alexander Hamilton and what he goes on to represent in the new government. Back to the Virginia and New Jersey plans. With the convention so bitterly divided, George Washington again decides to take 3 days and let them talk about these different plans and see if a compromise can be reached. During those 3 days, James Madison is working behind the scenes, meeting with folks, trying to see if he can find common ground. When the group comes back together after the 3-day recess, Roger Sherman, we met him last time, he was part of the 5-man writing committee. Roger Sherman gets to his feet and suggests compromise. Roger Sherman's an interesting character. Several of the members that summer described him as an odd fellow. One member even described him as bird-like in appearance and manner. If you happen to see his portrait, I think you'll understand the bird-like description, but he also had a peculiar habit of kind of bobbing forward and back as he spoke, which members thought made him look like a feeding bird. Roger Sherman got to his feet and suggested, gentlemen, we don't have to choose either the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan, we can have both. Let's create a bicameral legislature, a 2-house legislature. This is different from what existed under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was a unicameral legislature. It was one house called the Assembly. What Roger Sherman was suggesting was new. He said, we'll create a Senate in which each state will have 2 representatives, 2 senators. Every state will be equal. And then we'll create a House of Representatives where representation will be based upon population. This obviously is the compromise that we came to. Not immediately. It was going to take several days for Madison working with individual members to help them see the genius of this solution. Eventually, this compromise is adopted. It's known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. The issue of slavery is going to be much, much more difficult. The issue of race is still a difficulty today. It was just as hard back in the 18th century. The second issue the delegates had to confront was slavery. The question was how to gain enough support from the Southern delegates for the eventual passage of the Constitution. The delegates chose to approach the issue of race in two ways. The first way, and if you happen to have a copy of the Constitution, you can look in it and find the date, January 1st, 1808. The first way they chose to deal with the issue of slavery is to put an expiration date on it, so to speak, and those are my words. What the Constitution says is there will be no pronouncement on the issue of slavery before January 1st, 1808. In effect, what they were doing was giving slavery a 20-year protection, a 20-year grandfather clause. Now, different members have written about what that means. Some members suggested that that was time for businesses to get used to an economy without slave labor. Others suggested, I think naively, that slave owners would use this 20-year period of time to prepare their slaves for the responsibilities of freedom. They'd be taught a language or a skill or something like that. Regardless of what individual members wrote, what was adopted was this 20-year protection. Now, I want to give that some context. Why would founders that we otherwise see as very moral men put this protection in for slavery? At the time this was adopted, the number of slaves coming into the new country had gone down every year for over a decade. The numbers were dropping precipitously. Slavery was dying a natural death. So the men meeting in Independence Hall in 1787 believed that by the end of this 20-year period, they may not even have to take a vote on the issue. Slavery may have died that natural death. The evidence they were seeing was that slavery was becoming less and less popular. What changes that is Eli Whitney. The invention of the cotton gin made the need for slaves much higher. And as a result, what had been a dropping number of slaves skyrockets. So that effort to deal with slavery looks very, very different by the time they come to January 1st, 1808. While the members of Congress on that date did not vote to get rid of slavery, they did not abolish slavery, what they did do was put a prohibition on new slaves coming into the country. They would say that this is an incremental betterment, right? They're making an effort over time to get rid of slavery, making an effort towards abolition. We could argue pro or con on that today, but it is a move in the direction of abolition. What the founders called that was part of their gradualist approach to the eradication of slavery. The other way that they chose to deal with the issue of slavery was, of course, the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise, I think, is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the U.S. Constitution, so I want to go through this slowly. This was the solution to the question of how slaves would be counted for the purpose of representation. Right? We have these folks living throughout the country, mostly in the South, obviously, but we have to try to figure out whether or not we're going to count slaves for the purpose of representation. There are two basic proposals that are put forward at the convention. The non-slave states put forth a proposal to only count free persons for the purpose of representation. In other words, the free states, mostly northern states, said don't count slaves at all. The South should not benefit from their numbers in terms of representation. The slave states, mostly southern states, suggested the opposite. We should fully count slaves. That, of course, makes sense because those slaves make up a large population base in the South. The result was a compromise in which slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a free person. Or put a different way, for every 5 slaves, they would count as 3 free persons. That's where we get the fraction of 3/5. Now, this compromise was offered by James Wilson of Pennsylvania. James Wilson is an abolitionist. The northern states saw this compromise as a victory. They saw it as a victory for 2 reasons. First, it severely limited Southern power by limiting the number of Southern delegates in the House. Secondly, it moved the nation a step closer to abolishing slavery altogether. Again, this is part of the gradualist approach that many of the founders embraced. Unfortunately, cynical modern critics have suggested the agreement was the byproduct of racist attitudes on the part of all the founders who saw blacks as less than fully human. There were absolutely members of that body that had attitudes that we would find repulsive today. I would argue, however, that was a distinct minority. That was not the majority view. This view that somehow the founders were across the board racist, I think, is easily disproven. Keep in mind, it was the supposedly racist South that wanted to fully count slaves. It was the progressive Northern delegates that suggested not counting slaves at all. Secondly, free blacks were counted the same as free whites, regardless of where they lived. If race were the issue, there would have been an effort to discount free blacks as well, and that effort did not exist. Thirdly, it was a Northern abolitionist, James Wilson, who offered up the 3/5 compromise. There were delegates whose views were certainly, today we would say, racist, but they were a small minority of those who were in attendance. Now, many times during the convention, the founders thought about giving up. At no time during the summer of 1787 do George Washington's letters convey much hope. George Mason, who had been a member of the Second Continental Congress in 1776, also a member of this body, said, "I would not again serve in this convention for £1,000 per day." The revolt from Great Britain and the formation of our new government at that time were nothing compared to the great business now before us. Delegates worried that they might be seen as going too far by creating this new government. Their charge had been to reform the Articles of Confederation, not create an entirely new system of government. At one point, William Patterson of New Jersey said, "We shall be charged by our constituents with usurpation." The delegates understood that the Constitution they were creating would have great effect on future generations of Americans and around the world. James Wilson of the 3/5 Compromise said, "We're providing a Constitution for future generations and not merely for the circumstances of the moment." John Rutledge of South Carolina said, "We're laying the foundation for a great empire." James Madison said, "This plan will decide forever the fate of Republican government." Finally, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts said, "Something must be done, or we shall disappoint not only America, but the whole world." The convention in Philadelphia marked a distinct shift, a shift in the political leadership of the United States. Some of those that we think of as our founders didn't participate. Thomas Jefferson did not have a hand in creating the United States Constitution. He was our emissary to France. John Adams, likewise, so important in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, was not there in Philadelphia in 1787. He was in England. His cousin, Sam Adams, again so important in the Declaration, thought that the new Constitution betrayed the spirit of 76, although he would come around and later vote for its ratification. James Madison emerged as the most important leader of the Constitutional Convention. As a result, today he's known as the father of the Constitution. Now, of the 55 delegates who attended that summer, fully 16 refused to sign the final version of the Constitution. In fact, some of them actively campaigned against its ratification. Nonetheless, the form of government they created has endured for nearly 240 years, with just over 24 amendments, 10 of which, of course, were adopted in the first year after its ratification. Ours is the exception to the rule in terms of the enduring nature of our republic. One reason the U.S. has risen to the position of a superpower in so short a time is the permanence of our system. The new Constitution established the American Republic as an example of liberty to the world. Now, while that was going on in Philadelphia, we were creating the fourth and final of our great American founding documents. That's the Northwest Ordinance, and I want to spend just a couple minutes on that important document because it's often forgotten. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is also known as the Freedom Ordinance, and it is the lone legislative success of the Confederation government. Its purpose, of course, was to create the Northwest Territory as the first organized territory in the fledgling United States. The territory's size was enormous, incorporating what are now the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and a small sliver of Minnesota. The ordinance outlined a plan by which the various territories could petition the federal government for admission as a state once their population reached 60,000 persons. The first new state, of course, admitted under this plan was Ohio in 1803. Now, included in the bylaws of the ordinance were several radical ideas. The ordinance established the precedent that the United States would expand westward by the admission of new states rather than by the expansion of existing ones. This was a radical idea in that the geopolitical norm was for existing states to add to their own size and power. The second radical idea was that these new states, once admitted to the Union, would enjoy all the same rights and privileges as the original 13. The third and most radical idea included was the banning of slavery in these new territories. In making the Northwest Territory free from slavery, the government established the Ohio River as the boundary between the free and the slave states. This was part, as I said earlier, of a gradualist approach by our founders to first contain and then abolish slavery in our country. The prohibition against slavery was included in Article 6 of the ordinance, and it reads as follows, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereby the party shall have been duly convicted." The land that comprised the Northwest Territory was ceded to the British as part of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the French and Indian War. The United States then claimed the same territory after the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. The first proposal to divide the area into new states was put forth by Thomas Jefferson in 1784. Jefferson wanted to divide this large territory into 19 new states of roughly equal size. Jefferson was, of course, the principal author of the ordinance, while significant contributions were made by Nathan Dane and Manasseh Cutler and Rufus King. In the creation of the ordinance, it took 3 years to work out the overlapping and conflicting claims to the western lands by the states of Massachusetts and Connecticut and Virginia and New York. This job was made more difficult by a continuing British presence in violation of the terms of the Treaty of Paris. Nevertheless, a plan was agreed to and legislation was finally passed in 1787. It's important to remember that the Northwest Ordinance preceded, albeit slightly, our own Constitution. As such, many of the civil rights provisions of the ordinance were later incorporated into the Bill of Rights, which was completed in 1791. The ordinance included guarantees of the following. We're going to see all of these show up in the Bill of Rights. First, property rights. Second, religious tolerance. Third, a notion known as habeas corpus. This prevents unlawful detention. You have to be charged with a crime if you're going to be held. Fourth, there was a ban on excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. Fifth, we have a right to trial by jury. Sixth, a ban on ex post facto laws, or laws that are made after the fact, making a previous action criminal in nature. And then lastly, there was a pronouncement on education. The Northwest Ordinance says the following, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. This respect for widespread education is reflected in the U.S. Constitution as well. Rather than evidencing a belief that education was too unimportant for federal jurisdiction, the founders intentionally left the responsibility for education to the states, the entity closest to the people. Finally, the Northwest Ordinance had a significant effect on the Native Americans living in the Northwest Territory. In fact, the wording of the ordinance reflected the personal feeling of George Washington toward these Native Americans. I'm going to read you his words and you'll see how far we strayed from Washington's intent. Washington wrote this, quote, the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken without their consent, and their property, rights, and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed. President Washington intentionally expended a great deal of time and energy attempting to codify peaceful relations with the different Indian nations. Instead of a foundation of peace and mutual respect, Washington was forced into a policy of war, brought on by the continual flow of settlers from the east. In the end, President Washington chose to send a large army under General Anthony Wayne to break the back of the Shawnee and the Miami in this part of the country. This conflict ended with the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. This treaty, by which the native tribes gave away huge tracts of land, enabled the United States to move forward in making the Northwest Territory a more integral part of the nation. In conclusion, the ultimate effect of the Northwest Ordinance was to vastly expand the territory of the fledgling United States. It established a precedent that the new nation would look west for expansion. It established the principle that slavery must be contained and eventually abolished by government. It signaled that public education would be a priority in continuing to build the nation. And finally, it codified many of the civil rights, which later became part of our own Constitution and Bill of Rights. Thank you.